Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed.
Okay, let's get right to it. There's some buzz about potential direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, maybe in Istanbul, possibly even tomorrow, May 15th.
Yes, that's the latest. It stems from a proposal by the Russian president back on May 11th. The idea is to try and restart the dialogue that's been, well, stalled for more than 3 years now.
And the Ukrainian president, he's said he's ready to go to Turkey for a personal discussion. That sounds pretty significant.
It definitely is, especially when you think about where they started. Ukraine and European partners were really pushing for a ceasefire first, you know?
Right, whereas Russia preferred talks without any preconditions attached.
Exactly, so it's a shift.
Okay, so as of today, May 14th, we don't know the exact makeup of these delegations yet.
Not precisely. It's still being worked out, apparently. But we do know the Ukrainian president has signaled he intends to be there.
And Russia?
Russia's confirmed they're putting together their delegation. An aide to the Russian president even suggested things could kick off on the morning of the 15th.
Wow, okay. That's soon.
Very soon. And interestingly, they mentioned potentially using the 2022 agreement as a sort of baseline for talks.
The 2022 agreement.
Yeah, but with the understanding that obviously adjustments would be needed given everything that's happened in the last 3 years.
Makes sense. Now, what's this about potential U.S. involvement in Istanbul? That's quite noteworthy.
It is. The U.S. president, while he was traveling in the Middle East, indicated that the Secretary of State and acting National Security Advisor Marco Rubio were expected to attend.
And Rubio already had a trip planned to Turkey, right?
That's right, so the timing worked out.
And there was even talk of the U.S. president himself attending.
He did float that possibility, yes.
Yeah.
But conditional on both the Russian and Ukrainian leaders being present. He mentioned just yesterday on the 14th that he wanted to figure out the Russian president's plans first.
I see, so TBD on his attendance.
Right. But regardless of whether he goes personally, his special envoys are expected. Keith Kellogg.
The one focused on Ukraine and Europe dialogue.
Exactly. And Steve Witkoff, who's been more focused on Russia and the Russian president. Witkoff actually clarified yesterday that he and Rubio would be arriving in Istanbul on Friday.
Okay, so a significant U.S. presence is expected either way.
Seems that way, yes.
We're also seeing quite a bit of diplomatic activity from other countries trying to, well, smooth the path for these talks. Turkey, obviously, is central.
Absolutely. President Erdogan offered Turkey as the venue back on May 11th. He talked about a, quote, window of opportunity for peace.
But he also stressed the need for a ceasefire.
Yes, he emphasized that a full ceasefire should really be the foundation for any progress.
And Brazil's also stepped up with an offer to mediate.
That's correct. President Lula da Silva had actually planned to stop in Moscow after his China visit.
To personally ask the Russian president to join the Istanbul talks.
That was the stated aim, yes.
Yeah.
The Brazilian embassy in Moscow just called it a technical stop, but the intent seemed clear.
Interesting. And then there was that joint statement from China and Brazil.
Right. On May 13th, they welcomed the negotiation proposal and the Ukrainian president's response to it. They expressed hope for, finding consensus on a political settlement that addresses everyone's concerns.
This isn't the first time China and Brazil have tried something like this, is it? I recall a plan last year.
You're right. Back in May 2024, they put forward that 6-point peace plan. It covered things like a peace conference, humanitarian aid, civilian protection, prisoner exchanges.
And it got quite a bit of support, reportedly.
Over 110 countries, according to reports. But ultimately, it wasn't accepted by the EU, the U.S., or Ukraine. So they sort of regrouped and decided to renew their peace efforts in September, creating that Friends of Peace platform.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look at the actual conditions being put forward for a settlement. It seems like all sides have some fairly specific demands. Let's start with Russia's position, as stated around June last year.
Okay. Russia's conditions were quite extensive. They included a full withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, specifically within their old administrative borders.
Those being the 4 regions Russia claims to have annexed.
Correct. They also demanded Ukraine adopt a neutral, non-bloc, non-nuclear status, plus demilitarization and denazification.
And the territorial aspect.
They wanted what they termed Zakroplenia, basically, the formal for securing of the status of Crimea, Sevastopol, the DNR, LNR, Kherson, and Zaporozhye as Russian regions in international treaties.
DNR and LNR being the self-proclaimed republics.
Yes, and finally, the cancellation of all Western sanctions against Russia. A pretty comprehensive list.
Definitely. Now, what about Ukraine's conditions, their position as of April this year?
Ukraine's plan starts with a complete and unconditional ceasefire, air, land, sea, monitored by the U.S. and third countries. This would then ideally lead to a full peace agreement.
Okay, a ceasefire first. What else?
Security guarantees. Something similar to NATO's Article 5.
The collective defense clause.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. On territory, they said that would be discussed after a full ceasefire. Starting with the current line of control, getting back control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant with U.S. management involved, and the Kakhovka hydroelectric plant.
MPP and HPP, got it.
Right. Also, guaranteed access along the Dnieper River and control over the Kinburn Spit. And then there are economic aspects.
Right.
Implementing the U.S.-Ukraine minerals deal, getting financial compensation, including potentially using frozen Russian assets, and maybe easing sanctions on Russia as a peace deal gets implemented.
So quite details from Ukraine's side as well. And then there's this reported U.S. framework proposal. What does that outline?
Well, according to Reuters reporting on it, this framework apparently suggested recognizing Russian sovereignty over Crimea and its control over Luhansk and parts of Donetsk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye.
That's significant. What else?
It proposed Ukraine agreeing not to join NATO, but leaving the door open for potential EU membership. Security guarantees for Kyiv would come from European and other nations.
And the Zaporozhye plant.
Under this framework, Ukrainian control, but with U.S. operation, supplying power to both Russia and Ukraine. Also, unimpeded Ukrainian shipping on the Dnieper and canceling post-2014 sanctions against Russia.
So another set of complex trade-offs. What are experts like Steve Witkoff saying about the key sticking points?
Witkoff highlighted territory, the status of the Zaporozhye NPP, and Ukraine's access Dnieper River, Black Sea, as the core negotiation points.
Makes sense.
He also stressed that, ultimately, any settlement needs the Russian president's buy-in. And he mentioned that the U.S. president has set some kind of deadline for progress, hinting the U.S. might pull back from the process if things stall.
Okay, let's bring the European Union into this. What's their stance on these potential talks?
The EU has been pretty consistent in pushing for a temporary ceasefire as the very first step. They presented this idea in Kyiv just on May 10th and apparently shared it with the U.S. president, who reportedly backs it.
And they see a role for monitoring.
Yes, coordinating the monitoring with the U.S. And they also see a peacekeeping contingent as a key part of security guarantees for Ukraine. Though, historically, Russia hasn't been keen on NATO troops being involved.
Right. And the EU seems to be using sanctions as leverage here, too.
Definitely. After the Russian president called for direct talks, the EU warned about potential new energy and banking sanctions if Russia rejects a ceasefire.
We heard that from the German chancellor.
Yes, on May 12th. He called the Ukrainian president's willingness to talk a compromise and said further concessions were unacceptable. The French president also mentioned possible new restrictions if hostilities don't stop.
And the French president linked that to troop deployment.
He did. He suggested a European troop deployment, but away from the front lines, could offer Ukraine a security alternative outside of NATO. He also sort of acknowledged that Ukraine probably understands it can't regain all lost territory.
And there's been actual movement on EU sanctions just recently?
Yes. Just yesterday, EU ambassadors approved the 17th sanctions package against Russia. It still needs final sign-off on May 20th, though.
What's in this package?
It's said to target the so-called shadow oil fleet, those ships used to get around oil sanctions, and also third-country companies helping Russia evade sanctions.
But maybe not as tough as it could have been.
There are reports suggesting it might lack some more stringent measures, possibly due to potential blocking Blokharovki from Hungary or Slovakia. We'll see on the 20th.
And it's not just the EU looking at sanctions, the U.S. Congress, too.
Apparently so. A U.S. congressman mentioned that Congress is also prepping significant new sanctions, possibly targeting the Russian central bank and that shadow oil fleet again.
Okay, finally, let's touch on some expert analysis. What's the general feeling about whether these Istanbul talks could actually be productive?
Well, experts seem to think they could be, but, under certain conditions. The head of the Russian International Affairs Council pointed out how few points of contact there are right now between Russia and Ukraine.
So the U.S. supporting direct talks is a big deal in itself.
He suggested it's pretty significant, yes.
And what did he see as a possible best outcome?
He proposed that the most favorable scenario might involve an agreement reflecting Russia's core demands, followed by the U.S. pressuring Kyiv to actually implement those terms.
Why the need for U.S. pressure?
His view was that without it, Ukraine would likely try to avoid fulfilling those obligations. He also made the point that while Russia's basic demands haven't changed much since spring 2022, the situation on the battlefield has shifted.
In Russia's favor.
That was his assessment, that the Russian army holds the initiative now, and Russia's managed to stabilize its economy despite sanctions.
What about perspectives from other analysts, say, from the Pacific Forum?
A senior fellow there noted the Ukrainian president seems quite keen on personal talks with the Russian and Turkish presidents, maybe the U.S. president too, as a way to end the conflict.
So a personal push from the Ukrainian side.
It appears that way. But this analyst also stressed the Russian president's decision is ultimately key. He felt the general outline of a peace deal is sort of known troop disengagement, maybe third-party monitoring, prisoner swaps, then longer-term talks.
But acknowledging the current tough position.
Right. He acknowledged both sides still hold quite maximalist positions, but sees the very fact that negotiations might happen as an important sign, a potential step towards ending the conflict.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.